Hi, I'm Bill Wilt of Assured Research, and thanks for tuning into this short video focused on social inflation and liability loss cost trends. This comes from an Assured comment that we just released. Here we are in early October. The title is "Social Inflation is a Sufficient but Not Necessary Condition to Driving the liability loss ratio higher." Now, we wouldn't normally produce a video like this for a short one-page Assured comment. But we think you'll agree that there are some interesting graphs and insights in this long series that we put together showing the liability loss ratio next to a residual cost trend. And I'll explain what that is as I switch over here to sharing my screen and going through the graphs. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the residual trend, what is the residual trend? Those are the bars that you see there. What we've done is go back to the early 1970s when the annual statement first required the split out of individual lines of business. And we've captured the growth in liability loss and loss adjustment expenses. That is for other liability and product liability, occurrence and claims made combined. But we've removed from that to capture the residual trend, which is what the bars are showing. We've removed economic growth, which the proxy for which is real GDP, pretty good proxy. And we've removed a measure of inflation as most pertinent to property casualty insurers, and that is it's a blend of the annual growth in wages, medical costs, and legal expenses. So having removed those, we think growth and economic inflation, we think we're left with a decent proxy for the residual trend, or we are left with residual trend. The challenge is how to interpret that. Um, and what you see here, and that's in the blue bars again, and in red, we're showing the liability loss ratio for those lines of business that corresponds to the graph on the right hand, or the chart on the right hand side. And you see that periods of social inflation, mid 1980s, marked by the red arrows there in particular, mid 80s, early 2000s, and most recently over these last 4 or 5 years. Especially in the 80s and 90s, really correspond to an increase, a sharp increase in the liability loss ratio. And there's other areas you might look at and say, gee, the residual trends are rising, and that corresponds to an uptick in the liability loss ratio. But there are also some periods, and we mark that with the blue arrows at the bottom, where the residual trend is declining. So liability losses were growing more slowly than the combination of economic growth and economic inflation. Take, for instance, all the reform measures that were put into place, legal reforms put into place in the late 1980s following the liability crisis, that actually shrank the growth in liability losses. So we come away saying that social inflation is a sufficient but not a necessary condition for driving the liability loss ratio or higher, which we think is probably a reasonable interpretation of that graph. I'll just reiterate that we've been saying for some time, and I don't think this work disproves the assertion that social inflation holds greater sway over the liability loss ratio than does economic inflation, because actuaries and insurance professionals generally pretty good at spotting inflection points in economic inflation and starting to build those into their costs. But let's move forward and focus just on the residual trend and put it on a 3-year moving average basis, just to maybe smooth it out a bit. And again, you see the spikes there in the mid 80s and the early 2000s, corresponding with well-known bouts of social inflation. You see it's below zero for throughout the late 80s and even through much of the 1990s. reform had a really consequential impact at that time. Legal reform did. But want to draw your attention to the right-hand side of this graph, which we think is pretty interesting. Um, Many folks in the industry, not just Assured Research, look at the ingredients, the drivers of social inflation, and say, gee, a lot of them really had their roots in the financial crisis. You had, the real start at that around that time of sharp political divisions, um, maybe labor unrest, real wage growth started to slow. Um, you had a whole host of distrust in financial institutions and corporate America broadly as a result of the bailouts, putting that in air quotes, of the of so many companies coming out of the financial crisis. And it's interesting to observe that that is around the time that this residual trend in liability loss costs started to steadily increase. But what's notable too is that and I'll add that, as we mentioned in the assured comment, coincidentally, one of the world's largest and most successful litigation funders had its start, literally was incorporated or went public in the year 2009. So a lot of catalysts came together immediately post the financial crisis. The residual trend started to move higher and move steadily higher, in fact. But what's interesting too is it was right around 2017, 2018, as this line on the right crosses zero, that lots of insurance executives started to talk about social inflation. Again, around the time that the residual trend went from being negative, albeit rising, to decidedly positive. And in fact, it's averaged 8% since 2018. So it's a consequential accelerant to the growth in liability losses. That is social inflation, or this residual trend. So what's an insurance professional, what's an actuary to do with this? Not sure that either of these two graphs would pass muster in a rate filing, but certainly we think this makes the case for steady, regular examination of residual trends. It might be interesting to look at some other lines of business as well, but regular examination of residual trends, and I suspect more often than not, adding some provision for social inflation to economic inflation, because although it's volatile, it's certainly greater than zero for many of the years over this time series. And we look on the right hand side of this chart, looks like it could be greater than zero for some time to come. So we hope you found that helpful. If you're a subscriber, great. If you're not, reach out to us and we'd be happy to add you to a trial list to our work. Thanks so much for listening in.